Hey everyone, welcome back. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today for this explainer because we are diving into an apocalyptic collision that literally hammered the future of Asia into shape. We're going to explore a monumental piece of global history that is just incredibly vast, yet somehow it often slips right under the radar.
So I really want you to take a second and think about this staggering paradox. I mean, how does a conflict that claimed tens of millions of lives, burned entire cities to the ground, and fundamentally reshaped the 20th century become a shadow war, a chapter that's just so often quietly wedged right between the European Blitzkrieg and the Pacific Island hopping campaigns? Well, today we're going to unpack exactly how and why that happened.
All right, let's map out our journey for this explainer. We're going to hit 6 key areas: the Forgotten Shadow War, 2 paths to collision, igniting the Asian Inferno, endurance amidst horror, the war within the war, and finally, a legacy forged in blood.
Let's jump right in. Section 1, the Forgotten Shadow War, an overlooked apocalypse. You know, when we in the West think of World War II memory, our minds usually go straight to Dunkirk or the beaches of Normandy or maybe the Battle of Midway. But this complex, bloody, fragmented struggle in Asia was just as decisive. It was literally the blood-soaked stage that birthed modern global geopolitics, including the eventual creation of the People's Republic of China. And it came at an unthinkable cost: 20 million. That single, massive number represents the estimated death toll of the Second Sino-Japanese War. It's just a deeply sobering reality when you try to comprehend the sheer human scale of this event. This wasn't some neat Hollywood story of simple heroes and villains. It was a prolonged, agonizing struggle across a landscape of famine and ideological strife.
Moving right along to Section 2, 2 paths to collision, a mirror of empires.
To really understand the precarious situation that led to this inferno, we kind of have to look backward. The heavy weight of 19th century history basically set these two ancient neighbors on an unavoidable, violent trajectory. It's almost like looking at a mirror of empires. On one side, we have China's century of humiliation. They're facing Western gunboats, internal rebellion, and a fractured republic that's totally divided by regional warlords and crushing famine. But on the other side, we see Japan's Meiji Restoration. Shocked into modernization by American warships, Japan rapidly industrialized within a single generation. They blended modern factories and military tech with fierce nationalism and the ancient samurai code of Bushido. So you have Japan's unified, industrialized war machine standing in direct, glaring contrast to China's shattered, vulnerable republic.
Which brings us to Section 3, igniting the Asian Inferno, the point of no return.
This immense imbalance of power was a massive powder keg, right? And the escalation of full-scale war across East Asia didn't just happen overnight in 1937. It actually began way back in 1931, when a staged railway bombing gave the Japanese military a handy pretext to invade the super resource-rich region of Manchuria. By 1932, they'd formed a puppet state there. The tension just simmered for years until July 1937, when a chaotic nighttime skirmish over a missing Japanese soldier at the Marco Polo Bridge completely ignited the conflict. And here's the kicker. Instead of backing down, Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek gambled. He opened a second front in August 1937, which led to brutal modern street-to-street fighting in the Battle of Shanghai. It was an absolute meat grinder that cost nearly 250,000 Chinese soldiers.
Actually, let's zoom in on that 1932 event for just a second. Manchukuo was this puppet state ruled nominally by Puyi, who was the former last emperor of China. But in reality, it was ruthlessly exploited by Japan for coal, iron, and land. The really crucial takeaway here is that this puppet state taught Japanese generals that international law was incredibly paper-thin. I mean, China pleaded with the League of Nations, the League investigated, they declared Japan guilty, and then they did absolutely nothing. No sanctions, no troops, zero. Japan simply walked away from the League, basically proving to ambitious dictators everywhere that aggression carried zero consequences.
Section 4, endurance amidst unspeakable horror, survival is victory.
With the fall of Shanghai, the war entered a much darker phase. When the Nationalist Army retreated from their capital in late 1937, the Japanese army poured in, and what followed was a campaign of unspeakable terror. 300,000. That is the high-end estimate of victims slaughtered during the Nanjing Massacre. Over a period of weeks, soldiers rampaged through the city. They were executing prisoners, targeting civilians, and committing widespread horrific atrocities. It was a tragedy of such immense scale that it remains a deeply bitter open wound in the Chinese national consciousness to this very day.
So after Nanjing, surrender was simply not an option. It literally meant annihilation. China had to adopt a harsh, incredibly desperate strategy, which was essentially trading space for time. Chiang Kai-shek relocated his government deep into the mountainous interior city of Chongqing, and the military started utilizing increasingly desperate measures just to slow the Japanese advance. This even included deliberately blowing the dikes of the Yellow River, which unleashed catastrophic floods that drowned tens of thousands of their own people, all just to buy precious time. Merely surviving this onslaught had become the ultimate defining strategy.
Section 5. The War Within the War. A Fractured Resistance. Now here is the really wild part. Fighting the Japanese was only half the story. Before the full-scale invasion, China was already bleeding from a bitter civil war between the nationalist government and the Chinese Communist Party. To really get into the tactical mindset of the nationalist leader, consider this revealing quote from Chiang Kai-shek. "The Japanese are but a disease of the skin. The Communists are a disease of the heart." Wow. This really highlights his controversial priority of focusing on internal ideological enemies over foreign invaders. It actually took a mutiny by his own generals, the famous Xi'an incident in 1936, to force him into a temporary, highly mistrustful alliance with the Communists justified Japan.
And while the nationalists were grinding it out in these massive conventional battles, the communists were fighting a totally different kind of war up north. Mao Zedong's guerrilla strategy focused heavily on the rural population. He basically used the war as a seeding machine, employing grassroots tactics like promising rent reductions for peasants and integrating with local leadership. This was all to win the loyalty of the vast rural majority. Militarily, they zeroed in on railway sabotage and ambushes, which eventually culminated in the 100 Regiments Offensive in 1940. That was a massive coordinated strike that crippled Japanese supply lines and proved to the peasant population that the communists were fiercely committed to the resistance.
As you might guess, the Japanese military's response to this guerrilla warfare was absolutely merciless. They launched the Three Alls campaign: kill all, burn all, loot all. This was a devastating scorched earth counterinsurgency tactic. For the villagers caught in the crossfire of this war of attrition, it meant their harvests were stolen, their homes were burned, and their lives were constantly under threat. It was a brutal, terrifying daily reality that forced millions to flee or endure unimaginable hardship.
And that brings us to Section 6, a legacy forged in blood, the global climax.
As this immense regional stalemate eventually merged into the fiery conclusion of World War II, a really surprising pre-war global web of alliances was exposed. Get this, initially, the Soviet Union actually sent combat pilots and arms to help China because they feared Japanese expansion. And ironically, Germany, before they fully aligned with Japan, actually had military advisors training Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops. Plus, as we mentioned earlier, the League of Nations condemned the invasion but enforced absolutely zero sanctions. So the crucial takeaway for us here is that despite these strange shifting bedfellows, China stood largely alone in bearing the brunt of the Japanese war machine. That is, until the attack on Pearl Harbor finally brought the United States into the fray in 1941.
And then, after an 8-year nightmare, the end came with terrifying speed. In August 1945, a rapid, world-altering sequence of events just completely unfolded. On August 6th and 9th, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing unprecedented devastation. Right between those strikes, on August 8th, over 1 million Soviet troops invaded Manchuria, entirely shattering the Japanese Kwantung Army. Faced with nuclear annihilation and a massive Soviet advance, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th.
The war was finally over, but the land lay in total ruins. The nationalists were battered, while the communists had spent years building a hardened peasant-backed army. This completely set the stage for the resumption of a fierce civil war that would very soon give birth to modern China. And that brings us to a final provocative question for you all to think about. How does this legacy of survival as victory continue to dictate the geopolitics of East Asia today? Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just a shadow war. It was the crucible that forged national identities, exposed the frailties of global alliances, and proved that sometimes simply refusing to die is enough to change the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.